You ever notice how the things that really keep you up at night, a plane crash, a shark attack, are almost never the things that are an actual statistical threat to your life? It's kind of weird, right? There's this huge and honestly pretty frustrating mismatch between what we're scared of and what's actually dangerous. So today, we're going to dive into the psychology behind why our brains get risk so wrong. All right, to kick things off, a quick question for you. Which one of these do you think is more likely to cause a person's death? An accident, like a car crash, or diabetes? Just go with your gut. What does it tell you? We'll circle back to the answer in just a minute, but keep that guess in your head. So the reason that question might be a little trickier than it seems all comes down to a mental shortcut our brains are constantly using to try and make sense of this super complex world. And the first one, maybe the most powerful one, is something called the availability heuristic. It's a pretty simple idea, but wow, is it powerful. Basically, if you can easily remember an example of something, your brain just assumes it must happen a lot. Think about it. A dramatic story about someone winning the lottery really sticks in your mind, right? And it makes the odds of winning feel way higher than they actually are. So if a memory is vivid or recent or really emotionally charged, our brain flags it as being more probable. And you can totally see this playing out in the real world. For instance, researchers found that right after a big earthquake hits, people in California rush out to buy earthquake insurance. They secure their homes, the whole deal. But then, as the months and years go by, that terrifying memory starts to fade. And so does their sense of urgency. The actual risk of an earthquake hasn't changed one bit, but its availability in their minds sure has. But here's the thing. It's not just about what we can remember easily. It's also about what we feel intensely. Our emotions, man, they play a massive role in how we judge risk, and they often just completely overpower the cold, hard data. And here it is, the answer to our little pop quiz from the beginning. Remember what your gut told you? Well, a landmark study found that most people judged accidents to be over 300 times more likely to cause death than diabetes. The reality? Not even close. Diabetes is actually 4 times more deadly. And we see this pattern all over the place. We think diseases and accidents are kind of equally risky, but the truth is, diseases are 18 times more likely to get us. So, why the gigantic gap? Well, a huge piece of the puzzle is media coverage. Let's be honest, a dramatic plane crash or some rare case of botulism makes for a much better story than the slow, quiet progression of a super common disease. The media covers what's new and what's emotional, and that coverage shapes the world inside our heads, making really unusual events feel way more common than they are. And this leads us to our second big idea, the affect heuristic. When we're faced with a really hard question, something like, what are the statistical risks and benefits of this new technology? Our brain just swaps it out for an easier one. How do I feel about it? If something gives you a good vibe, you judge the risks as low and the benefits as high. And if it gives you a bad feeling, you do the exact opposite. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt just nailed it with this quote. He said, "The emotional tail wags the rational dog." Think about that. Our emotional reaction comes first, and then our rational brain just scrambles to find a good reason to justify that feeling after the fact. Our feelings are literally dictating our facts. Okay, so we've got these little mental shortcuts happening inside our individual brains. But what happens when they get amplified across an entire society? Well, you get a full-blown panic. Let's break down how a tiny story can explode into a national crisis. The mechanism behind this is called an availability cascade. It's basically the availability heuristic on societal level steroids. It's this self-sustaining feedback loop where a story about some kind of risk just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Not because the risk itself is actually growing, but because our collective attention and fear are just feeding on each other. So here's how the cycle works. First, some media story about a risk grabs the public's attention. Then, the public's worry becomes a news story in itself, which of course leads to even more coverage. That's when you see what are called availability entrepreneurs, think activists or special interest groups, who jump in to keep the flow of worrying news going. And eventually, the whole thing gets so big that politicians have to respond, often based more on the public's feelings than on the actual evidence. A textbook example of this is the Alar scare from 1989. A report came out saying a chemical used on apples caused cancer in lab rats when they were given absolutely gigantic doses of it. But that little detail got lost. The media, with a big boost from celebrity testimony, created this massive public panic about poison apples. The fear got so intense, listen to this. One person actually asked if it was safer to pour apple juice down the drain or to take it to a toxic waste dump.
I mean, seriously, a toxic waste dump. That just captures the sheer level of panic. The statistical risk was minuscule, but the emotional reality for people was totally overwhelming. And in the end, public pressure forced the chemical right off the market.
What all of this really highlights is a core problem. Our brains are just not built to handle small probabilities. When we hear about a risk, we imagine the terrible outcome, the scary part, but we completely forget about the actual probability. We either round the risk down to zero and totally ignore it, or we see that scary image in our heads and we give it way, way too much weight. There's almost no in between.
This gap between public fear and statistical reality, well, it leads to a really difficult question for any democracy. If our fears are so easily manipulated by emotion and media stories, who should be making the big decisions about risk? Should it be the public, or should it be the experts who actually understand the data? You've basically got two main camps on this. On one side, there's legal scholar Cass Sunstein. He argues that risk is something you can measure objectively, in lives saved, in dollars and cents. He thinks policymakers need to be protected from these irrational public panics and just let impartial experts make decisions based on data. But then on the other side, you have psychologist Paul Slovic. He argues that risk is always subjective. He says that in a democracy, you just can't ignore widespread public fear, even if it seems totally irrational to the experts. And this really gets to the heart of Slavic's point. He argues that the very act of choosing how to measure risk, is it deaths per million people, is it something else entirely, that choice is a political one. As he puts it so powerfully, defining risk is thus an exercise in power. Whoever gets to define the risk, well, they hold all the power. So where does that leave us? How are we supposed to live in a world where our own brains are so easily tricked? How do we make better decisions, not just for ourselves, but for our whole society? Let's look at a modern example: terrorism. Statistically, your risk of dying in a terror attack is incredibly low, especially compared to something like a car accident. But the images, they're horrific. They're unforgettable. They get repeated on the news endlessly. They completely bypass our rational brain and speak directly to our faster, more intuitive emotional system, making the threat feel constant and absolutely huge. It's a perfect modern-day availability cascade. At the end of the day, there's no easy answer here. We can't just hand over all the decision-making to the experts because that's just not how a democracy is supposed to work. Widespread here is a real political force, and it has very real consequences. The reality is, the same mental shortcuts that help us get through our day-to-day lives are also what make us biased, and that just makes the business of governing ourselves pretty messy. So I'll just leave you with this question. The next time you see some scary story completely taking over the headlines, just for a second, pause and ask yourself, am I reacting to what is statistically real, or am I just reacting to what my mind finds most easily available?